Have you ever wondered what it feels like to be treated as if you don't belong right in a place you helped build? Imagine boarding a flight with nothing more than your dignity, only to be told your seat is not yours. The world looks away as uniformed staff humiliate you, and strangers' silence cuts deeper than the insults. Now imagine you had a choice to stay silent and accept it, or to stand tall and reveal a truth that would shake the skies forever. What would you do if the very airline that tried to strip you of respect turned out to be your own? Would you fight back? Would you forgive? Or would you show the world that justice is not about anger, but about courage? As you listen, place yourself in his seat. Could you bear the weight of prejudice and still lead with grace? This is not just a story about one man. It's about all of us. It's about dignity, justice, and the power of truth when it refuses to stay hidden. Stay with me, and let's uncover how humiliation turned into hope. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you won't miss the rest of this journey. The afternoon sun glared through the tall glass windows of Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport. The concourse buzzed with families dragging oversized suitcases, business travelers clutching laptops, and the occasional voice over the loudspeaker announcing delays. Among the sea of travelers walked Jonathan Miles. He wasn't dressed to impress, at least, not in the way people expected of a powerful man. A navy button-down shirt, sleeves rolled neatly, a pair of well-worn loafers, and a leather carry-on bag that had clearly seen years of loyal service. He moved with calm purpose, scanning his boarding pass as he reached Gate C-24. Jonathan was flying first class, Seat 2A, on Apex Airlines. On paper, he was just another passenger heading out on a business trip. What no one around him knew was that he wasn't just flying with Apex, he owned Apex. With 57% of the shares, Jonathan was the majority shareholder and CEO of the parent company. But he had chosen to travel quietly, without assistance, without announcement. He wanted to see what the customer experience felt like when no one knew who he was. At the gate counter, a woman with a sharp bob haircut and a name tag that read, Linda Ward, looked up. Her eyes flicked from Jonathan's face to his ticket. She tilted her head, a thin smirk forming. "Sir," she said, her tone dripping with suspicion. "Are you sure you're at the right gate?" Jonathan blinked. "Yes, Flight 372, Dallas to New York, first class, Seat 2A. He handed her the boarding pass. Linda scanned it, pursed her lips, then gave him a once-over. Her voice carried just enough volume to make heads turn nearby. "First class is up here, not back there," she said, gesturing toward the economy line as if he'd made a mistake. A few passengers chuckled under their breath. Jonathan kept his expression calm, though a familiar heaviness pressed against his chest. This wasn't the first time he had felt the sting of assumption that a black man in simple clothes couldn't possibly belong in first class. He spoke evenly. "I know where my seat is. I'd like to board." Linda held his ticket to the light, as though checking for a watermark. "This looks unusual. You didn't, print this at home, did you?" Jonathan offered his ID and his Platinum Elite card. "Everything should be in order." She looked at the ID, then back at him. Her smirk widened. "I just want to make sure there's no mistake. You understand." From behind Jonathan, a middle-aged man in a tailored suit muttered, "Just loud enough for others to hear. Must have been a glitch in the system." The laughter spread, small but sharp, cutting into Jonathan like shards of glass. He straightened his shoulders, refusing to show the sting inside. His thoughts churned. Do I shut this down right now? Do I tell her who I am? But another voice rose, calm and steady, the one his father used to speak with. "Patience, son. Let people reveal themselves. Truth doesn't need to shout." Jonathan slid his ID back into his wallet, his hands steady. "Are we finished here?" Linda hesitated, as though deciding whether to push further. Finally, she clicked her tongue and waved him through with exaggerated reluctance. "Fine. Go ahead. But don't be surprised if the crew asks questions once you're on board." The passengers in line stared as Jonathan walked past, some with curiosity, others with barely concealed disdain. He felt the weight of their gazes, but kept his eyes forward. The jet bridge was cool and quiet, a relief after the heat of humiliation. Jonathan took a deep breath, steadying his mind. He told himself he would not let anger decide the day. Yet even as he stepped onto the aircraft, the echo of Linda's voice followed him like a shadow. "Are you sure you're at the right gate?" Jonathan stepped onto the plane, with the cool hum of the air vents filling his ears. He let the rhythm of the engines calm him, but even as he moved toward first class, he could feel eyes lingering on his back. The moment at the gate had not gone unnoticed. Whispers carried, trailing behind him like an unwelcome echo. He slid into seat 2A, his carry-on tucked neatly in the overhead. For a moment, he let out a slow breath, thinking perhaps the worst of it had passed. The seat was wide, the leather soft against his shoulders. He adjusted his watch, looked out the oval window, and told himself that soon he'd be in New York, ready for the meeting. He had deliberately disguised himself to attend. But quiet never lasted long when bias had already set its mark. From the front of the plane, Linda Ward reappeared. She leaned in to whisper something to a man with a gray suit and a badge clipped to his pocket. Mark Benson, the gate supervisor. Mark's jaw tightened as he turned toward Jonathan, his eyes narrowing as though he'd been presented with a problem to solve. Jonathan saw it in the man's walk before he heard the words, the brisk, self-important stride of someone who thought authority made them untouchable. "Sir," Mark said, stopping at Jonathan's row, "we need to check your boarding pass again." Jonathan looked up, his expression calm. He offered the pass without hesitation. Mark barely glanced at it before frowning. "This doesn't look right," he muttered. "Are you sure this was issued for today's flight?" Jonathan's voice was steady, low. It scanned at the gate, twice. "Everything is in order." Mark shifted his weight, his lips pressing thin. "You'll have to step off the plane for additional verification." The passengers nearby perked up, eyes widening. The businessman in seat 3A leaned closer, whispering to his neighbor with a smirk. "Told you, glitch in the system." Jonathan held his ground. "With respect, I'm already seated. My documents have been checked. Twice. If there's an issue, perhaps it can be resolved without removing me." Mark's tone sharpened. "Sir, you need to cooperate. People like you can't just—" He stopped himself, but the words hung heavy in the air. Jonathan's eyes flicked around. Several passengers caught the unfinished sentence. Some frowned. Others chuckled quietly. The silence after was worse than the words themselves. He felt that familiar ache again, the one that came every time prejudice tried to remind him he didn't belong. Inside, a part of him wanted to speak the truth, to tell the supervisor that he owned the very airline whose uniform Mark wore. But another part, the one tempered by years of endurance, whispered, "Not yet. Let them dig their own hole." Jonathan folded his hands over his lap, his tone calm but firm. "I have nothing more to prove. I am not moving." Mark's nostrils flared. "Then I'll call security." From behind, a voice piped up, a young woman holding her phone halfway raised. She had been recording. He showed his ID already. I saw it. You're harassing him. Mark turned, his face reddening. Ma'am, this doesn't concern you. But it did. By then, half the first-class cabin was watching, some with quiet disapproval, others with the gleam of spectacle. Jonathan felt the moment teetering on a knife's edge, tension so thick it pressed into his lungs. He looked down at his hands, then back up at Mark. His father's words echoed again. Patience, son. Truth doesn't rush. It reveals itself. So Jonathan said nothing more. He sat tall, shoulders squared, eyes steady. His silence was louder than any protest. Mark stepped back, flustered, and muttered to Linda, We'll get the crew involved. They'll handle him. Linda's smirk returned, sharper now. She tapped her radio. Minutes passed, though they stretched like hours. Passengers shifted in their seats, whispering. A man in 2C, later introduced as Claire Simmons, adjusted her glasses and muttered into her phone, This is going on record. Jonathan's pulse was steady, his breathing slow. Outwardly, he was a picture of calm. Inwardly, he wrestled with a familiar storm. Why should I still face this, after everything I've built, after all I own? He thought of his employees, thousands who depended on Apex for their livelihoods. If they knew their leader endured this at his own airline, what would they feel? Ashamed, empowered. The sound of footsteps interrupted his thoughts. Another figure appeared. Greg Holman, the lead flight attendant, tall and broad-shouldered, his movements brisk. He had once been a police officer, and he carried himself as if the badge still hung at his side. Greg glanced at Linda, then at Jonathan. His lips curled into something between a sneer and a smile. Sir, I'm going to need you to step off this aircraft. Jonathan didn't move. And why is that Greg folded his arms? Because you don't belong here. A ripple of gasps passed through the cabin. Some shook their heads. Others looked away. But Greg's tone carried authority, and that made his words dangerous. Jonathan exhaled slowly. He could feel the heat rising in his chest, the urge to push back, to end this charade by revealing his title. Yet he knew the moment he did, the lesson would be lost. They would say, "Oh, if we had only known." And that wasn't the point. He leaned back against the leather seat, his voice quiet, resolute. I purchased this ticket. I belong exactly where I am. Greg's eyes narrowed. Security will remove you if you don't comply. From the back. The businessman who had mocked earlier muttered again, louder this time. Knew it. Scam artist. Jonathan ignored him. He kept his gaze on Greg, unflinching. For a moment, the two men stared at each other. Silence like a taut wire ready to snap. Then Greg tapped his radio. Security to row 2. We have a problem, passenger. Jonathan closed his eyes briefly, steadying his breath. This is just the beginning, he told himself. Let them come. The truth always finds the light. And as the whispers swelled around him, the camera lenses lifted and the tension sharpened. Jonathan sat perfectly still, anchored in dignity, while the storm gathered. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as boarding continued, passengers shuffling past with the rustle of coats and the clink of roller bags. Jonathan sat motionless in seat 2A, his back straight, his hands resting calmly on his thighs. Outwardly, he was composed. Inside, his chest tightened with each glance cast his way, each whisper that rippled like static through the rows. He had endured these moments before, but there was something heavier about it today. Perhaps it was the quiet certainty that the storm was only beginning. Across the aisle. Claire Simmons shifted in her seat, her phone angled discreetly. Her brow was furrowed, lips pressed together in disapproval. She looked like she wanted to say something, but held back, choosing instead to let her camera record. Greg Holman loomed a few rows away, speaking in low tones with Linda and Mark. Their body language carried the arrogance of certainty. They believed they were in the right, that Jonathan was the problem, that their authority would prevail. Linda gestured toward Jonathan with a flick of her wrist, as if he were an object rather than a man. Passengers trickled past, some offering Jonathan sympathetic glances, others eyeing him with skepticism, a few with outright disdain. A woman with pearl earrings leaned over to her husband and whispered, "You'd think they'd catch fake tickets before boarding." Her husband chuckled. "They'll toss him off soon enough." Jonathan caught every word. He turned his gaze toward the window, watching a fuel truck crawl along the tarmac. He reminded himself to breathe, to stay steady. Anger burned just beneath the surface, but he forced it into stillness. His dignity was the only shield he had and the only weapon he needed. The cabin door closed with a dull thud, and the overhead bins clicked shut one by one. Greg strode down the aisle, his shoes thumping heavily against the carpet, stopping again at row 2. He placed a hand on the headrest of seat 2B and leaned in close. "Sir, this is your final warning," he said, his voice low but firm. "Step off the aircraft, or security will drag you out." Jonathan turned his head slowly to meet his eyes. "I am not moving." Greg's jaw twitched. "Don't make this harder than it has to be." Jonathan's voice was calm, measured. "The only difficulty here is the assumptions you're making." Greg straightened, clearly not used to being defied so quietly. He glanced toward Mark, who gave him a nod of encouragement. Linda stood in the galley, arms crossed, her expression smug. Then came a voice from behind. A woman with short blonde hair, Karen Doyle, spoke loudly enough for the cabin to hear. "Honestly, this is ridiculous. First class isn't for everyone. If he can't follow the rules, he should be in the back where he belongs." A ripple of agreement passed from row to row. Not everyone spoke, but several nodded or murmured assent. The air grew thick with judgment. Jonathan's fingers curled slightly against his knee. He wanted to respond, to defend himself, to shout the truth. But he held back. Instead, he turned his head, his gaze sweeping across the faces staring at him. His silence was not weakness, it was defiance. Claire's voice broke the tension. "You don't get to decide where someone belongs," she said sharply, surprising herself with her own courage. Her phone was still raised, recording every second. Karen scoffed. "Spare me the lecture. You know what I mean?" "No," Claire replied firmly, her eyes flashing. "I don't, and neither should anyone else here." A hush fell. For a brief moment, the current shifted. Jonathan met Claire's eyes, offering the faintest nod of gratitude. Greg exhaled loudly. Frustration etched across his face. "Enough," he barked. "We're taking off in 5 minutes. Security will handle this." From the rear of the cabin, 2 security officers, Tanner and Joe, entered. Their presence drew a mix of curiosity and unease. Passengers craned their necks, phones discreetly rising to capture the unfolding drama. Jonathan's heart pounded, but his face betrayed nothing. He had expected this escalation. He tightened his grip on the armrest, preparing himself for whatever came next. "Sir," Tanner said, his tone more rehearsed than hostile, We need you to come with us." Jonathan shook his head. "I have done nothing wrong. I will not leave my seat." Joe stepped forward. "Then we'll have to remove you by force." The businessman from earlier, the one who had muttered about glitches, leaned back in his seat with a grin. Finally, about time they dealt with him. The officers reached down, their hands closing around Jonathan's arms. Gas rippled through the cabin. Some passengers averted their eyes, unwilling to watch. Others leaned in, hungry for spectacle. As Jonathan felt himself being lifted, pain shot through his shoulder. He clenched his jaw, refusing to cry out. He would not give them that satisfaction. Greg's voice rang out. "You see, disruptive passenger, causing a scene." But Jonathan was silent, his expression carved from stone. They dragged him down the aisle, past faces filled with pity, with judgment, with shame. Claire's voice rose again, strong now. "You're assaulting an innocent man. This is being recorded." No one else spoke. The silence of complicity was deafening. "At the galley." Greg pointed toward the rear. "Put him in the closet. Keep him out of sight until landing." Jonathan's stomach turned, but he did not resist. Every step, every humiliation, he endured with quiet resolve. He told himself that this was not the end. It was only a chapter, and when the truth emerged, as it always did, the shame would not be his to carry. Inside the cramped storage closet, the door clicked shut. Darkness swallowed him. The air was stale, thick with the scent of cleaning supplies. He sank against the wall, his ribs aching, his breath shallow. For the first time that day, doubt crept in. "Is this worth it? Should I have revealed myself, ended this before it began?" He pressed a hand against his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart. No. Let them show the world who they really are. From outside, faint voices carried. Linda's laughter, Greg's low grumble, the muffled murmurs of passengers speculating, and beneath it all, the sound of a single phone. Still recording, still bearing witness. Jonathan closed his eyes. He thought of his employees, of his family, of the generations before him who had endured far worse indignities without the power he now held. His pain was real, but so was his strength, and he knew deep in the silence of that dark closet that this storm was far from over. The closet door rattled with the vibration of the engines as the plane taxied. Jonathan sat hunched on the floor, knees pulled close, the sting in his ribs a steady reminder of how far the humiliation had gone. His suit, once crisp, was wrinkled, his cuffs smudged from the rough hands of the guards. He let out a slow breath, reminding himself, "Stay still. Let them show the world." Outside the door, muffled laughter drifted through. Linda's voice rang above the hum. "Unbelievable! Can you imagine the nerve, thinking he can just sit there, pretend like he belongs?" Mark's tone was cooler, but no less cutting. "We can't let someone like that get away with it. Makes the whole crew look weak." Greg's low growl joined in. "He thought he could outsmart us. Not on my watch. People like him push boundaries. You got to push back harder." Their words sliced through Jonathan, but he forced his body to remain unmoving. He remembered his grandfather's advice, spoken decades earlier on a Georgia porch at Dust Dignity, is the fight you don't show them you're fighting. Back in the cabin, the mood had shifted. Passengers whispered nervously, some ashamed of their silence, others firm in their judgment. Karen Doyle, ever loud, muttered to anyone who would listen, "They should have taken him off before we even boarded. All this wasted time, because he wouldn't accept his place. The businessman with the smirk added, "Hope they make him pay for delaying us. Folks like that always think the rules don't apply." But Claire Simmons sat rigid, her phone still recording in her lap. The red light blinked steadily. She glanced around the cabin, frustration building. You all see what's happening. Right. This isn't about rules. It's about who they think deserves respect. A man across the aisle avoided her eyes. "Look, lady, I just want to get to Chicago. Not my problem." Claire's jaw tightened. That's exactly the problem. At the rear. Tanner and Joe lingered near the closet. Their voices hushed. Joe muttered, "Feels wrong. Man, he wasn't violent. Didn't raise his voice. Nothing." Tanner shifted uncomfortably. "Orders are orders. You saw Greg's face, he'd have our jobs if we questioned him." "Yeah," Joe said. "But jobs ain't worth trampling a man's dignity." The cockpit door opened, and Captain Ellis stepped out, his presence commanding the aisle. Tall, broad-shouldered, silver hair peeking from under his cap. He had the aura of authority passengers trusted. He frowned when Greg approached. "Problem contained?" Ellis asked. Greg straightened. "Yes, Captain." Passenger was disruptive. Removed from seat. Secured in the rear. Ellis's gaze was sharp. Secured. He isn't a criminal. Greg's tone hardened. "Sir, he refused multiple orders. He challenged the crew. That's grounds for removal." Ellis studied him, then sighed. "Fine, but make sure we don't have a lawsuit on our hands. Last thing Apex needs is bad press." Claire's voice rose from her seat. "Too late. This is a lawsuit waiting to happen, and the press will eat it up." She lifted her phone slightly, enough for Ellis to see the blinking red light. Greg glared. "Put that away. Recording isn't allowed." Claire met his stare. "Good luck stopping the millions already watching this live stream." Gasps echoed from nearby passengers. Phones came up, screens glowing as people scrambled to find the video. A low murmur grew into a buzz, tension crackling through the cabin. Ellis's eyes narrowed. "Live stream." "Yes," Claire said, "and it shows everything. Him sitting quietly, you dragging him, locking him in there like an animal." She pointed toward the rear. Greg's face flushed. "She's twisting it." But the evidence was spreading. Passenger by passenger, phone by phone. A teenager in row 8 whispered, "It's already trending." Apex racism. The captain pinched the bridge of his nose. "Damn it." Meanwhile, in the closet. Jonathan heard the muffled swell of voices, felt the vibration of shifting energy. He leaned closer to the door, straining to catch fragments. He couldn't make out words, but he sensed it, momentum turning. Inside, doubt battled with hope. Do I end this now? Do I reveal who I am? He pictured his employees, the thousands of families who depended on the airline he had built from the ground up. He thought of his mother, who had once been denied a seat on a bus decades ago, forced to walk in the rain with groceries digging into her arms. Her voice echoed in memory. "Don't ever let them decide your worth." His phone buzzed faintly in his pocket. He pulled it out, squinting in the dim light. A message from his COO, Lena Carter, lit the screen. "We're seeing it. It's blowing up. Stand strong. We're with you." Jonathan closed his eyes, gratitude swelling. He typed back with steady fingers, "Not yet. Let them show themselves fully." Back in the cabin. Ellis returned to the cockpit, muttering about delays and damage control. Greg barked at the crew to hold the line, but Linda's confidence began to crack. She whispered to Mark, "What if this goes viral? What if corporate sees Mark's lips tightened?" "We stick to the report. Passenger was disruptive. That's all anyone needs to know." Yet passengers were no longer silent. Murmurs turned into pointed remarks. "He wasn't disruptive. I didn't see him do anything. They went too far." Karen Doyle snapped at them. "You people don't understand. Order has to be maintained. If we let people like him think they can get away with..." She cut herself off too late. Several passengers stared at her, disgust clear in their eyes. Claire seized the moment. "Say it. People like him. That's what this is all about. Isn't it?" Karen flushed red, fumbled with her handbag, but her words hung in the air, poisonous and undeniable. At that moment, the closet door clicked. Tanner hesitated before pulling it open. Jonathan blinked against the sudden light, his tall frame unfolding as he rose slowly to his feet. Gas rippled across the cabin. He looked disheveled but unbroken, his presence filling the narrow aisle. His voice, when he spoke, was low yet resonant, cutting through the hum of the engines. "I have been quiet. I have endured your hands on me, your insults, your closet. But make no mistake, every moment has been witnessed, not just by the people here, but by the world outside this cabin." Greg stepped forward, sneering. "Sit back down. You're not in charge here." Jonathan's eyes met his evenly. "That's where you're wrong." The words hung, enigmatic, charged with an authority Greg couldn't comprehend. Claire's phone caught every second. Passengers leaned forward, their faces a mix of awe and anticipation. The balance of power had shifted, though the crew didn't yet realize how drastically. Jonathan turned slightly, addressing the cabin. "This isn't about a seat. This isn't about rules. This is about dignity. And what happens when people forget we all deserve it?" The silence that followed was electric, filled with the weight of something larger than the cabin itself. In that silence, Jonathan knew the moment of truth was near. The hum of the engines deepened as the aircraft lifted into the night sky. Jonathan steadied himself in the aisle, feet planted firmly, refusing to be cowed by the stares that met him. For a moment, no one moved, as if the entire cabin was suspended in the weight of his words. Then Greg broke the silence, striding forward, his voice dripping with disdain. "Sit down now, or I'll have you restrained like the threat you are." Jonathan didn't flinch. His eyes were steady, his voice even. "I am no threat. The only danger here is the abuse of power." Gas rippled through the rows, passengers shifting, some shrinking back, others leaning in with growing curiosity. Karen Doyle sneered from her seat. "Abuse of power. Please, you caused this scene. You don't belong here, and everyone knows it." Claire rose halfway from her seat, her phone angled to catch Karen's outburst. "Say it louder," she snapped. "Show everyone exactly what you mean." Karen's face flushed, but she muttered, "You twist everything." Greg raised a hand toward Tanner and Joe. "Restrain him. Now." The two officers hesitated. Tanner shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable. Joe muttered, "Captain should handle this." But Greg barked louder. Now they stepped forward reluctantly, but Jonathan lifted a hand, palm outward. His voice carried authority that startled even them. "Touch me again, and you'll regret it." The officers froze, caught between duty and doubt. They had never seen a man exude such calm defiance in the face of humiliation. Passengers murmured. A young mother in row 6 whispered, "He's not doing anything wrong. Why are they treating him like this?" Her child tugged at her sleeve, whispering, "Mom, Why are they being mean to him? Her eyes glistened as she pulled her daughter close. Because some people forget what respect means. Jonathan heard her words, and strength surged through him. He glanced down the aisle, meeting Claire's gaze once more. She gave a subtle nod, as if to say, "Keep going. Don't back down." Mark Benson leaned toward Linda near the galley, whispering urgently, "We're losing control of the cabin. If corporate hears this version—" "We're finished," Linda hissed back. "Stick to the script. Disruptive passenger. Nobody will believe otherwise." But the tide was shifting. Too many witnesses. Too many recordings. Too much truth seeping into the open. Karen suddenly stood, pointing a finger at Jonathan. "This flight is unsafe with him here. He's aggressive. He's threatening us all. I demand he be restrained." Claire's voice cut through. "No, he's not. What's unsafe is lies, like yours." Greg stepped between them, glaring at Claire. "Sit down, ma'am. Don't interfere." Claire's jaw clenched. "I'm not interfering. I'm witnessing." The tension was suffocating, the air heavy with unspoken divisions. Jonathan stood silent, letting their words reveal themselves for what they were. Then Captain Ellis's voice came over the intercom, calm, clipped, practiced. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing some turbulence. Please remain in your seats." The plane jolted slightly, but the real turbulence was in the cabin. Greg, red-faced, pointed again. "Restrain him now." Joe swallowed hard, then shook his head. "No, he's not a threat. I won't do it." Gasps filled the air. Greg rounded on him. "You're insubordinate." Joe's voice rose. "I'm a human being before I'm an employee. And what you're doing is wrong." Tanner's eyes darted between them, torn. "Finally," he muttered. "He's right. This doesn't feel right." Greg's fury exploded. "Both of you are finished." But Jonathan's calm voice broke through the storm. "No, gentlemen. You've just saved your souls." Passengers applauded softly. Scattered claps that grew into a steady rhythm. Karen hissed, "Brainwashed fools." But her voice was drowned in the rising swell of support. For the first time, Jonathan felt the weight begin to shift. The silence of complicity was cracking, replaced by the stirrings of conscience. Still, Greg wasn't finished. He strode back toward the cockpit, muttering into the interphone. His voice carried fragments disruptive, threat, emergency protocol. Jonathan's mind raced. If the captain declared him a danger, they could divert the plane, land early, escalate beyond recovery. He had to hold steady. He had to let them expose themselves fully before stepping into the light. As the plane leveled, the cabin settled into uneasy quiet. Passengers exchanged glances, whispering, some clearly shaken by what they'd witnessed. Jonathan returned to seat 2A, moving slowly, deliberately. He sat tall, eyes forward, hands folded in his lap. His composure was a statement louder than any words. Claire leaned across the aisle, voice low but urgent. "Why don't you just tell them who you are? And this now." Jonathan turned his head slightly, meeting her eyes. Because sometimes the truth needs to be revealed by those who try hardest to hide it. Her breath caught, as though she understood something deeper than the words. She sat back, clutching her phone tightly. Minutes stretched into hours. The cabin lights dimmed, the steady drone of the engines a backdrop to restless minds. Jonathan's body ached, but he refused to show weakness. His silence was louder than Karen's muttering, stronger than Greg's threats. Somewhere behind him, a teenager whispered, "He's brave." His friend replied, "No, he's more than that. He's unshakable." Jonathan heard it, and though his face remained still, a flicker of warmth spread through his chest. He wasn't alone. Near the galley. Linda tapped at her tablet, trying to draft a report that fit their narrative. Mark hovered over her shoulder, dictating phrases. Disruptive, refused orders, physical resistance. Linda muttered. But that's not what happened. Mark snapped. It's what will make happen. Their exchange was overheard by the young mother, who whispered to Claire. Claire's eyes widened, her phone camera tilting subtly to catch their hushed conspiracy. The trap was tightening not around Jonathan, but around those who had tried to break him. As the night deepened, Jonathan closed his eyes, inhaling slowly. He thought of his late father, who had worked 3 jobs just to keep food on the table, who had always told him, "Strength is proven in silence, not shouting." He thought of the employees who trusted him, the communities who depended on him. He thought of the ancestors who had walked roads far harder than this, and he knew whatever storm awaited when the wheels touched down, he would meet it with the same quiet fire. The hum of the engines was steady, almost soothing, but inside the cabin tension churned like a storm. Jonathan sat upright in 2A, his gaze fixed forward, his silence radiating defiance. His calm was unbearable to some. Karen Doyle couldn't stop herself from fidgeting, twisting her pearls, her eyes darting between passengers. Finally, she stood, her voice sharp enough to pierce the low drone of conversation. This man is dangerous. He defied orders. He threatened the crew. And now the whole flight is at risk. Several passengers stirred uneasily. The businessman, with the smirk from earlier, nodded in agreement, muttering, "She's right. He's trouble. Greg seized the opportunity. You all heard him resist authority. You all saw him refuse lawful orders. If we don't act together, he could endanger everyone here." Claire shot up from her seat. "That's a lie, and you know it." She raised her phone higher, her voice strong. "He hasn't threatened anyone. He hasn't raised his voice. The only threat is the people trying to cover up their own prejudice." Karen turned on her, her eyes blazing. "Are you blind, or just another bleeding heart who thinks rules don't matter?" Claire didn't back down. Rules matter, but so does truth. And the truth is, this man was dragged, humiliated, and locked away without cause. The cabin erupted in voices, some echoing Karen, others murmuring support for Claire. The divide was sharp, lines drawn in the air like invisible battlefronts. Greg raised his hand for silence. "We can't let one disruptive passenger compromise safety. If the authorities won't restrain him, then we have to ensure order ourselves." It was a dangerous suggestion, but fear and prejudice are powerful accelerants. The businessman stood, emboldened. "He's right. We can't just sit here waiting for him to act out. We should move him ourselves." Gas rippled through the rows. Jonathan didn't move. His voice, when it came, was quiet but steady. "If you put your hands on me, you will regret it. Not because I'll fight you, but because the world is watching." But the smirking man sneered, "The world doesn't care about people like you." He glanced around for allies. Karen's hand shot up in agreement. A burly trucker in flannel grunted assent. Even Greg stepped forward, urging them with a look. The mob was forming. Claire's voice rang above the din. "Don't do this. You're letting your worst instincts decide for you." But already, the businessman and the trucker advanced. Karen egged them on. "Do it. Get him out of here before he hurts someone." Jonathan's pulse quickened, but outwardly he remained composed. He remembered training in self-defense from years ago, quiet mornings at the gym, long hours disciplining body and mind. He hated conflict, but he would not be broken. The first hand reached for his arm. Jonathan stood, swift and controlled, sidestepping the grasp. His chair clattered back against the bulkhead. The movement startled those around him, but he did not lash out. He simply stood tall, his presence commanding. "Do not touch me," he said evenly. The businessman lunged again, but this time Jonathan caught his wrist, twisting just enough to send him stumbling back into the aisle. Gas erupted. The trucker stepped forward, but Joe, the officer who had earlier refused Greg's orders, moved between them. "Enough," Joe barked. "This man isn't the danger." "You are," Greg snarled. "Get out of the way." "Joe." Joe squared his shoulders. "No, I won't let this cabin turn into a lynch mob." The word hung heavy, dark, undeniable. Several passengers froze, the ugly weight of history suddenly pressing down. Karen shouted, her voice cracking. "You're exaggerating. Nobody's talking about that." But Claire's voice cut in. "That's exactly what this is. A mob ganging up on one man because of who he is, not what he's done." For the first time, the murmurs of the cabin leaned in her direction. A woman in row 9 whispered, "She's right. I saw everything." He was quiet until they dragged him. Another passenger added, "I've been recording too. I'll share it." Greg's face blanched. His authority, once unshakable, was slipping. He barked orders, trying to regain control. "Everyone sit down." Sit down now, but the spell was broken. The mob faltered, the businessman backing into his seat, muttering curses. The trucker sat with a scowl, folding his arms. Karen fumed, but her voice trembled when she spoke again. "You'll all regret siding with him." Jonathan eased back into his seat, his breathing steady though his ribs ached. He looked across at Claire. For a brief moment, their eyes met in shared resolve. The captain's voice broke the silence once more. "Ladies and gentlemen, we ask for calm. Any further disruptions will force us to divert this flight." The warning hung in the air, but passengers were no longer looking at Jonathan as the disruption. Their eyes had shifted to Greg, to Karen, to the crew who had manufactured the storm. Greg retreated toward the galley, his confidence fractured. He muttered to Linda and Mark, "This is spiraling. If corporate gets this footage, we're done." Linda's hands shook as she clutched her tablet. "It's already out there. I can feel it." Mark's face was pale. "Then we doubled down. Passenger refused orders. End of story." But their story was crumbling, piece by piece, under the weight of witnesses and recordings. Jonathan sat back, shoulders squared, his silence once again louder than any words. He had not raised his voice, not lashed out, not descended into the chaos they had hoped to provoke. And that quiet defiance was more powerful than the mob itself. In the dim cabin light, the young mother whispered to her daughter, "Remember this? Remember how one man stayed calm when everyone else lost their way." The child whispered back, "He's brave." Jonathan heard it faintly, and though he did not smile, his heart steadied. He knew the worst was not over, but he also knew the tide was shifting. Somewhere above the clouds, the mob had turned, and dignity had begun its quiet fight back. The cabin settled into an uneasy quiet after the failed attempt to mob Jonathan. Passengers shifted in their seats, avoiding eye contact, some ashamed, others still bristling. Greg retreated to the galley, his face slick with sweat, muttering to Linda and Mark as if plotting their next move. Jonathan remained in 2A, upright, composed, his eyes steady on the aisle. The hum of the engines masked the pounding of his ribs, but his silence remained a shield that not even bruises could pierce. Claire leaned across the aisle, her phone still poised. "It's going viral," she whispered. "They can't cover this up anymore." Jonathan gave a faint nod. His thoughts churned with restraint. He could end it right now with a few words, but he chose patience. The truth revealed itself best when oppressors grew arrogant enough to believe no one was watching. Mark suddenly raised his voice, trying to reassert control. "Ladies and gentlemen, we remind you that disruptive behavior will not be tolerated. This flight is under full crew authority." His words were flat, rehearsed, but they rang hollow. The businessman who had tried to grab Jonathan muttered from his seat, "Maybe if he'd just followed the rules, none of this would have happened." Claire turned toward him sharply. "Or maybe if people like you didn't assume guilt based on the color of his skin, none of this would have happened." Her words hung heavy, slicing the air with uncomfortable truth. Several passengers looked down at their laps, unwilling to meet her gaze. In the galley, Linda's hands trembled as she tapped at her tablet. "Greg, there are too many recordings. They'll see everything." Greg snarled. "Then we control the narrative before the plane even lands." He resisted. He was aggressive. He endangered the cabin. Joe, standing nearby, shook his head. "That's not true. And you know it," Greg snapped. "You want to keep your job." Officer Joe's jaw tightened. "Not if it means lying about what I saw." The quiet rebellion sent a ripple through the crew. Even Tanner shifted uncomfortably, glancing at Jonathan's still figure in two-way. The balance of loyalty was starting to shift. Suddenly, a ping rang out across multiple phones in the cabin. Passengers checked their screens. Claire's live stream had exploded, crossing 500,000 views. Comments scrolled rapidly, outrage pouring in from strangers watching across the country. "In apex racism," one passenger read aloud, his voice stunned. "It's trending. Right now." Gas filled the air. The young mother clutched her child's hand tighter. Karen paled, but masked it with anger. "So what internet mobs don't change facts?" He broke the rules. Jonathan finally turned his head, his voice quiet but steady. "The only rules I broke were the ones written in your prejudice." The words struck like a hammer. Claire caught it perfectly on her feed. The cabin went still, as if the engines themselves held their breath. Greg stormed forward again, his fury unchecked. "Enough of this. You think you can turn this cabin against me. You think some video will save you." Jonathan rose slowly, the movement deliberate, dignified. His eyes never left Greg's. "It won't save me. It will save the truth." Greg lunged, his hand reaching for Jonathan's shoulder, but Tanner stepped between them at the last second. "Stop," Tanner said firmly. "This has gone too far." Greg recoiled, incredulous. "You're siding with him." Tanner's voice didn't waver. "I'm siding with what's right." Claire stood, emboldened. "You're not the only one." She panned her phone across the cabin, capturing the faces of passengers now emboldened enough to nod, to murmur agreement. Karen's voice shook with rage. "This is madness. You're all letting one man hijack this flight with lies." But her words were weaker now, stripped of conviction. Jonathan spoke, his tone almost gentle. "No one here is being hijacked. You are being shown who you are, and soon the world will know too." The atmosphere shifted palpably. Fear clung to Greg, Linda, and Mark, their authority slipping like sand through their fingers. The mob had dissolved into silence, the passengers more fearful of being caught complicit than eager to accuse. At that moment, Jonathan's phone buzzed again. He slipped it from his pocket discreetly. A message from Lena Carter lit the screen. CNN has picked it up. You're everywhere now. Stay strong. He tucked the phone away, exhaling slowly. The closet of humiliation had been reopened, not with force, but with truth shining through cracks no one could patch. Greg tried one final grasp at control, his voice rising in desperation. Captain Ellis will have you arrested the moment we land. Everything you've done tonight will be documented against you. Jonathan met his words with calm fire. Then let it be documented. And when it is, make sure they include the laughter outside the closet, the mob you incited, the child who asked why I was treated as less than human. Make sure they record not just my silence, but your noise. The applause started softly again, a smattering of claps from the back. Then it spread, passenger to passenger, until the cabin swelled with it. Greg's face twisted in disbelief, his authority shattered by the very people he had tried to manipulate. Karen hissed, "Fools, all of you! You'll regret this." Claire turned her phone toward Karen. "Say it again. I dare you." But Karen sat down, clutching her pearls, her face red with rage and fear. The hum of the engines filled the pause. Jonathan remained standing, his presence filling the cabin, his dignity untouchable despite everything inflicted upon him. And in that suspended moment, everyone understood. The truth was no longer hidden in the closet. It was alive in the aisle, undeniable, unstoppable. The applause quieted into an uneasy hush. The cabin filled with the hum of engines and the flicker of overhead lights. Jonathan stood tall in the aisle, his frame steady, his expression calm but unyielding. Every passenger's eyes were fixed on him, and for the first time since boarding, the weight of silence belonged to him, not Greg, not Karen, not anyone else. Greg sneered, refusing to give up. You think you've won because some passengers clapped. You're still nothing but a disruptive passenger who's going to be escorted off in handcuffs. Jonathan tilted his head, his voice even, measured. Is that so? Mark stepped forward, gripping the back of a seat. That's right. Once we land, the report will show you resisted authority, endangered crew, and incited chaos. No live stream will erase that. Claire shook her head, her phone still raised. Actually, millions have already seen the truth. And unlike your report, the internet doesn't forget. The businessman muttered under his breath. So what corporate will protect its own? They always do. Jonathan turned then, his gaze sweeping the cabin, resting briefly on Claire, the young mother clutching her child, the teenagers whispering at the back, the passengers who had found their courage too late. His voice softened but carried to every row. You've all been asking who I am. Some of you assumed I was less. Some of you chose silence. A few of you chose courage. Now it's time for the truth. He slipped a sleek black leather wallet from his inner pocket and pulled out a silver-edged card. The cabin lights glinted off embossed lettering as he held it up for everyone to see. His words landed like thunder. My name is Jonathan Miles, majority shareholder and chairman of the board of Apex Airlines. Gas exploded around him. The businessman's smirk vanished. Karen clutched her pearls so tightly her knuckles whitened. Even Tanner and Joe froze, eyes wide, realizing just who they had manhandled hours earlier. Greg's face went slack, the color draining. You. What Jonathan stepped closer, holding his card steady. This airline, the seats, the wings, the very logo on this plane belongs more to me than to any of you. And tonight, every insult, every humiliation you threw at me wasn't just aimed at a passenger. It was aimed at the man who signs your paychecks, The words rippled like a shockwave. A stunned silence swallowed the cabin, followed by a chorus of whispers, disbelief mixing with awe. Claire lowered her phone slowly, her lips parting in astonishment. "You're the Jonathan," gave a small nod, his eyes softening as he met hers. "Yes. And I chose to fly tonight, unannounced, without privilege, without entourage, to see how our customers are truly treated." He turned deliberately toward Greg. "And what I saw was abuse of power, prejudice dressed up as procedure, and the arrogance of men who thought no one was watching." Greg stammered, his voice cracking. You can't, this isn't Jonathan," cut him off, his tone sharp for the first time. "This is exactly what it is. You humiliated a paying customer, you incited a mob, and you locked me in a closet like cargo. Every second of it is recorded, every word already broadcast. There is no covering this up." Linda's hands shook so badly she dropped her tablet. Mark sank into a seat, his face pale as ash. Karen's voice was a shrill whisper. "You tricked us! This was a setup!" Jonathan looked at her, his gaze piercing. "No, Mrs. Doyle, I didn't trick you. You revealed yourself. All I did was sit in my seat." Passengers erupted in murmurs again. The young mother whispered fiercely to her daughter, "Remember this moment. Remember what truth looks like when it finally stands." The child's wide eyes stayed locked on Jonathan, as if seeing a story unfold larger than any she'd been told before. Greg tried to regain footing, his words tumbling out desperately. "Captain Ellis won't back this. You can't just fire us mid-air." Jonathan's tone was firm. "Absolute. Watch me." He turned toward Tanner and Joe. "Escort Mr. Holman, Ms. Ward, and Mr. Benson to the galley. They are relieved of duty immediately. Gas again." Tanner hesitated, looking at Greg. "Sir, are you sure Jonathan's voice carried the authority of ownership itself? I don't ask. I decide." Joe stepped forward, his grip firm on Greg's arm. Greg tried to yank away, but the fight had left him. His eyes darted desperately across the cabin, searching for support, finding none. Passengers who had once cheered his authority now turned away in shame. Linda covered her face with trembling hands as Tanner guided her from the aisle. Mark stumbled after them, muttering about false reports and misunderstandings, but no one listened. Jonathan watched them go, then faced the cabin once more. His voice softened, not with weakness, but with conviction. "This is not just about me. It's about every passenger who has been made to feel less than human because of the way they look, where they sit, or what someone assumes about them. This airline will not be a place where dignity is negotiable," Claire whispered, almost to herself. This is history." Jonathan inclined his head slightly. "No, this is justice. History will be what we build after." The applause returned, stronger this time, swelling through the rows until the whole cabin shook with it. Even those who had doubted, who had stayed silent, found themselves clapping not just for Jonathan, but for the truth he had unearthed. Karen sat frozen, unable to join, her face a mask of disbelief. The businessman buried his face in his hands. The trucker looked down at his boots, ashamed. The teenagers cheered openly, recording every second. Jonathan remained standing, letting the applause wash over him, not for ego, but for affirmation that dignity had prevailed. He exhaled slowly, his ribs aching, but his spirit unbroken. The storm had broken, and the light was his to carry. By the time Flight 372 touched down in Austin, the world outside had already shifted. Screens across terminals, hotel lobbies, and living rooms glowed with headlines. Airline chairman humiliated on own plane. Apex racism trending worldwide. Justice at 30,000 feet. What began as a routine flight had detonated into a cultural earthquake. As the plane taxied to the gate, Jonathan Miles sat in silence, his hands folded neatly on his lap. The applause had faded into a hum of nervous chatter, but his mind was already elsewhere on what awaited beyond the glass walls of Apex headquarters. Claire leaned over, lowering her voice. "Jonathan, when you step off this plane, you won't just be a CEO anymore. You'll be a symbol. People will look at you as proof that no one, not even the most powerful, is safe from prejudice." Jonathan nodded slowly. "And that's why we can't let this be just another scandal. It has to mean something. It has to change something." Tanner, standing nearby, cleared his throat. "Sir, the press is already lined up at the terminal. Security has set up a corridor, but it's intense out there." Jonathan offered him a small, grateful smile. "Then we walk through it. With dignity. Always dignity." When the cabin doors opened, the roar of cameras and voices poured in like a tidal wave. Flashes burst, microphones thrust forward, and reporters shouted questions that blended into a wall of sound. "Mr. Miles, how does it feel to be assaulted by your own staff? Will heads roll at Apex? Do you believe racism is systemic in the airline industry? Are you pressing charges?" Jonathan raised a hand, not to silence them, but to steady the moment. His voice cut through the chaos, calm but commanding. "I will answer all your questions, but not here, not in a hallway. There will be a press conference at Apex headquarters in 2 hours. Every answer will be given then." The crowd groaned with impatience, but his authority was unquestionable. Cameras still followed as he stepped into a waiting black SUV, Claire sliding in beside him. The drive to headquarters was a blur of sirens, news alerts pinging on every phone, and Jonathan's quiet breathing as he prepared for the war ahead. Inside the Apex Tower in Dallas, panic reigned. Executives crowded into boardrooms, phones glued to their ears, lawyers whispering about liability, public relations drafting and scrapping statements by the minute. Richard Cole, Apex longtime CEO, was pacing near the windows, sweat dotting his forehead. "This is catastrophic," Richard muttered. "Our stock has dropped 20% in 4 hours. Investors are demanding answers. Jonathan's stunt is going to sink us all." From the corner, Elaine Porter, head of HR, spoke up, her voice icy. "It wasn't a stunt, Richard. It was a reality check. And it's not Jonathan who put us here. It's the culture we let rot under our watch." The room fell quiet as Jonathan entered, flanked by Claire and Tanner. His presence was like a jolt of electricity, calm, collected, but unarguably in control. He moved to the head of the table, not waiting for an invitation. "Let's be clear," Jonathan began, his voice steady. "This isn't about a PR crisis. This is about dignity. What happened on Flight 372 was not an isolated mistake. It was the symptom of a deeper disease. And it ends tonight." Richard bristled. "Jonathan, with respect, we need to think strategically. Sacrifice a few employees. Issue an apology. Let the storm pass. That's how these things are handled." Jonathan's eyes narrowed. "Handled? You think dignity is something to handle? No, Richard. This isn't a storm to wait out. It's a mirror, and it shows us exactly who we are." Claire leaned forward, her tone precise. "Millions have already seen the footage. They've seen employees humiliate a black man, lock him in a closet, and incite a mob against him. The fact that he happens to be our chairman only magnifies what every passenger of color has felt for years. You can't spin this. You can only fix it." Elaine gave a firm nod. If we don't overhaul everything, training, reporting, accountability, we won't just lose customers, we'll lose our soul. Richard scoffed. Our soul doesn't pay the bills. Investors want stability. Jonathan's gaze turned sharp. And investors will get it, but through reform, not denial. We're about to show the world that Apex doesn't run from truth. We rebuild from it. For 2 tense hours, the boardroom became a battleground. Executives pleaded for half measures. Lawyers begged for softer language. While Jonathan held the line, nothing less than systemic change would suffice. Finally, as the city's skyline dimmed into evening, consensus was forced by the weight of reality. At 7 p.m., Jonathan stood before a wall of cameras, the Apex logo glowing behind him. The world leaned in through televisions, phones, and streaming feeds as he began to speak. 2 days ago, I boarded Flight 372 as a passenger. I did so quietly, without title, without privilege, because I wanted to see what our customers experience when they trust us with their journeys. What I witnessed was prejudice, abuse of power, and a complete failure of the values this airline claims to uphold. And yes, I was humiliated, assaulted, and locked away. But this isn't about me. It's about the countless passengers who've endured similar indignities without the power to fight back. Flashes went off like fireworks. Reporters scribbled furiously. Jonathan's tone stayed calm, but his words cut like steel. As of tonight, those responsible for what happened are no longer employed at Apex Airlines. Effective immediately. We are implementing sweeping reforms, a zero-tolerance policy for discrimination of any kind, mandatory bias and dignity training for all 45,000 employees, an independent passenger advocacy office reporting directly to me, and a whistleblower system to ensure no voice is silenced. Furthermore, every complaint from the last 5 years will be reviewed, and restitution will be offered where harm was ignored. Gas rippled through the press corps. This wasn't spin. This was revolution. And to our passengers, Jonathan continued, his voice softening, I give you this promise: you will be treated with dignity. Not because it's good business, though it is, but because it's the right thing. Justice isn't a press release. It's what we do when tested. The room erupted in questions, but Jonathan simply stepped back, signaling the press conference was over. His words would stand on their own. Back in the boardroom, Richard sat in stunned silence, his earlier bravado crumbling. You've turned this company upside down, he muttered. Jonathan looked at him evenly. No, Richard, I've turned it right side up. The night stretched long, but outside the tower, something rare was stirring. Messages flooded and passengers sharing their own stories. Employees quietly thanking Jonathan for standing up. Even competitors begrudgingly admitting Apex had set a new bar. On social media, hashtags multiplied. Name justice at 30K feet. Dignity first. D. Apex rising. For the first time in years, hope took flight alongside fear. The press conference had ended. The headlines were already spreading like wildfire. And yet Jonathan Miles felt the quiet ache of solitude creeping in as the night deepened. His ribs still throbbed from the blunt force of the fire extinguisher Greg had swung in desperation. The adrenaline that had carried him through the flight and the boardroom had finally drained, leaving only pain, fatigue, and the heavy stillness of reflection. He sat alone in his office, the Dallas skyline glittering beyond the window, his jacket draped over the back of his chair. A half-drunk glass of water sat on the desk beside a stack of unopened messages, both congratulatory and condemning. Claire had insisted he should rest. Tanner had offered to drive him home, but Jonathan had waved them off. He needed this moment's silence. No cameras, no staff, no applause, just him and the truth. For the first time since the ordeal began, doubt crept in. He pressed a hand against his side, wincing at the tenderness. "What if I made things worse?" he murmured to the empty room. He thought of the passengers on Flight 372, the young mother whispering to her child, the businessmen who had sat in cowardly silence, the teenagers who had cheered once the tide turned. Had his revelation empowered them? Or had it only confirmed what they already feared, that justice comes only when the powerful are humiliated into action? He leaned back, closing his eyes. His father's voice echoed in memory, deep and steady. "Son, dignity is heavy. Sometimes carrying it feels like a burden, but it's what makes you unbreakable." Jonathan had lived by those words, but tonight he wondered if the burden had grown too heavy even for him. The door creaked open. Claire stepped in, her expression softer than he'd ever seen. She didn't ask permission. She simply set a small paper bag on the desk. "I thought you might not have eaten." Jonathan opened his eyes. Startled. "You shouldn't still be here." "I couldn't sleep," she admitted, pulling up a chair. She unpacked a simple meal chicken soup, bread rolls, and an apple pie slice, clearly from the cafe down the street. "You fed the world with your words tonight. The least I can do is feed you." He chuckled weakly. "You're a lawyer and now a caretaker. What can't you do, sleep?" "Apparently," she quipped. Her eyes softened. "Jonathan, I know tonight was monumental, but I also know what it cost you." He hesitated, then admitted quietly, "I can't shake the thought that people will only remember me as the man who got kicked off his own plane. Not the man who built the airline, not the man who worked his way up from nothing, but the victim of a spectacle." Claire leaned forward, her tone firm. "No. They'll remember you as the man who stood back up, who turned humiliation into hope, who proved that dignity isn't just a word in a company handbook, it's a way of leading." Her conviction eased the tightness in his chest more than the soup ever could. He sipped slowly, grateful for the warmth, the simplicity of being cared for in a moment when he felt most hollow. Later that night, when Claire finally left, Jonathan lingered by the window. The city lights blurred through the haze of exhaustion, but another memory surfaced: his mother's face, worn from long hours working as a nurse, telling him, "Never forget, John, there will always be people who look at you and see less, but that's not your fight. Your fight is to remind them you are whole." He whispered the words aloud, almost like a prayer. "I'm whole." The following morning brought no rest. News vans clogged the streets around headquarters, protesters and supporters alike chanting slogans. Some demanded justice for passengers. Others, wearing Apex uniforms, begged for jobs not to be sacrificed to scandal. The noise was deafening. Inside, Richard Cole confronted him again. "Jonathan, this is spiraling. Investors are calling for my resignation. They want you to take over as acting CEO immediately." Jonathan frowned. "You sound surprised." Richard slammed a fist against the table. "Because I've led this airline for 15 years. Yes, I made mistakes, but you think you can just sweep in?" And Jonathan cut him off, voice quiet but firm. "This isn't about me sweeping in. It's about accountability. You let this culture fester. You ignored complaints. And last night, you suggested we bury the truth to protect numbers. That is why investors no longer trust you." Elaine entered then, holding a folder. The board already convened an emergency vote. "Richard, it's done. Jonathan is acting CEO effective immediately." Richard's face turned crimson, his voice cracking. You'll regret this. You'll regret taking my seat." Jonathan met his glare evenly. "This isn't about a seat. It's about keeping the promise we made to every passenger who walks down our jet bridge that they will be treated with dignity." Richard stormed out, leaving silence in his wake. Elaine placed the folder on Jonathan's desk. "These are the first reports from our whistleblower hotline. Dozens came in overnight. It's worse than we thought." Jonathan opened the folder, scanning through the accounts. Flight attendants speaking of racial profiling. Ground staff confessing to discriminatory customer codes whispered behind counters. Pilots admitting they had looked the other way. His chest tightened with both anger and resolve. "This is the real cost," he said quietly. "Not my ribs, not the headlines. The real cost is the trust we've lost." Elaine nodded solemnly, "And the only way to repay it is with change." That evening, Jonathan returned to his apartment, where for the first time in days he allowed himself to collapse on his couch. He winced at the pain in his side. But it wasn't just physical. The emotional toll weighed heavier: the betrayal of employees he'd trusted, the loneliness of leadership, the fear that no matter how hard he fought, the world might never change fast enough. His phone buzzed, a message from an unknown number. He opened it hesitantly. It was a photo of the young girl from Flight 372 clutching a crayon drawing. She had drawn him standing tall in the aisle, arms outstretched like a shield, with the words, "You made us safe," scrawled in uneven letters at the top. Jonathan's throat tightened, his eyes stinging. He whispered to the empty room, "This is why." The pain in his ribs didn't vanish, but it dulled under the weight of something stronger: hope. He realized then that the personal cost, however steep, was worth it if it planted even one seed of courage in the next generation. And in that moment of quiet clarity, Jonathan Miles vowed not only to rebuild Apex Airlines, but to redefine what dignity in the skies would mean for every soul who dared to fly. 2 weeks after the press conference, Apex Airlines was still on every news ticker, every trending feed, every conversation in coffee shops and boardrooms. The reforms Jonathan Miles had announced were rolling out at breakneck speed: training modules, hotline systems, new reporting structures. Yet for all the sweeping change, one question lingered in the air: what would happen to those who had crossed the line? Public opinion was divided. Some demanded lifetime bans, permanent blacklisting, and even criminal charges for employees like Greg Holman, Linda Ward, and Mark Benson. Others argued that punishment alone wouldn't fix the deeper issue. Jonathan himself wrestled with the tension nightly. Justice mattered, but so did transformation. If Apex was to lead by example, could it afford to embrace not just accountability, but also redemption? The answer began to take shape in a quiet meeting room on the 23rd floor of headquarters. Elaine Porter, head of HR, laid out a proposal. "Jonathan, the hotline reports are staggering, but they're not just stories of harm. They're also confessions: employees admitting complicity, silence, or fear. Many want a chance to make it right. What if we gave them one?" Jonathan leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled. "You're suggesting what amnesties, not amnesties," Elaine corrected, her tone precise. "Conditional restoration, a program where those who harmed or ignored harm can earn their way back through transparency, education, and service. Call it accountability with hope." Jonathan was silent for a long moment, the memory of Greg's sneer still vivid. But he also remembered Linda's trembling hands, Mark's pale regret, even Tanner's hesitation before obeying his order on the plane. The line between villain and bystander wasn't always clear. "Second chances," Jonathan murmured at last. "Not cheap forgiveness, but earned redemption. If we can build a path back for those willing to walk it, we'll prove dignity isn't just about punishing wrong. It's about restoring what's broken. And so, the Second Chance Initiative was born. The announcement shocked the public. At a new press briefing, Jonathan stood before the cameras once again. We are committed to accountability, but we also believe in the human capacity to change. Employees who have violated our standards but show genuine remorse will enter a structured program, mandatory public acknowledgement, completion of advanced anti-bias training, and 200 hours of community service with organizations fighting discrimination. Only then can they reapply for positions at Apex or its partner companies. There will be no shortcuts, no guarantees, but there will be a way back. The backlash was immediate. Why give racists another shot, one commentator demanded. Isn't this just weakness? Another cried. But for every critic, there were voices of support, civil rights leaders praising the balance of justice and restoration, community organizations volunteering to host reformed employees, and passengers writing in to say, if they can change, maybe the world can too. The first test came with Greg Holman himself. Cameras swarmed the courthouse steps when he emerged from his disciplinary hearing. His once proud posture collapsed into shame. For days, he avoided the press. Then, unexpectedly, he requested a private meeting with Jonathan. They met in a small conference room. No cameras, no audience. Greg's voice shook as he spoke. I don't deserve this program. I was cruel. I abused my authority. But I need to tell you why. Not as an excuse, but as an explanation. My father was a pilot. He drilled into me that order and authority kept planes safe. Somewhere along the way, I twisted that into believing I was above the people I served. I lost sight of the fact that passengers are not obstacles. They're the reason we exist. Jonathan studied him, weighing every word. Greg's eyes brimmed with something Jonathan hadn't seen before. Not arrogance, but regret. You humiliated me, Greg, Jonathan said quietly. You endangered lives. You locked me away like luggage. If this program is to mean anything, you'll have to face the people you hurt, not just me. Greg nodded slowly. I'll do it, whatever it takes. Weeks later, the world watched a very different Greg Holman stand on a community center stage in Houston, before a crowd of passengers, employees, and civil rights activists. He read a written statement of accountability. His voice faltered at times, but he did not hide. I was wrong. I let bias control me. I let power corrupt me. I hurt a man who deserved respect, not because of his title, but because he is human. And I hurt countless others by creating a culture of fear. I cannot undo what I did, but I will spend every day proving I can be better. The crowd's reaction was mixed skepticism, anger, cautious hope, but it was real. Redemption wasn't instant, and it wasn't easy, but it had begun. Linda Ward followed next, choosing to record a video message rather than stand in public. In it, she admitted to years of quiet compliance, enforcing discriminatory customer codes she knew were wrong. I was afraid of losing my job, she confessed, tears streaking her cheeks. But fear is not an excuse for silence. I want to learn to be braver. Mark Benson, the supervisor, returned to his hometown in Oklahoma, volunteering with a nonprofit that taught underprivileged youth about aviation careers. Reporters filmed him cleaning classrooms, tutoring students, and telling them, "Don't make the mistakes I made. Lead with fairness, not fear." For Jonathan, these stories were not absolution, but they were proof that dignity could spread not just by punishing the guilty, but by transforming them. Privately, he still wrestled with doubt. Late nights found him replaying the flight in his mind, Greg's words echoing, Karen's shrill accusations, The weight of being seen first as less before being recognized as more. Could second chances ever erase scars that deep one evening, while reviewing reports in his office, he received a handwritten letter. It was from the young girl on Flight 372, the one who had drawn him as a shield. Inside was another drawing this time. Not just Jonathan, but Greg too, standing side by side. Above them, she had scrawled, "Everyone can change." Jonathan stared at the picture for a long time, the simplicity of a child's hope cutting through his exhaustion. Maybe second chances weren't about erasing scars at all. Maybe they were about proving scars could teach us how to heal. The press eventually began to shift. Headlines read, "From Villain to Volunteer, Apex Radical Second Chance Program. Can redemption take flight?" Even skeptics admitted that something unprecedented was unfolding, a company not only confronting its sins, but daring to model forgiveness with accountability. And through it all, Jonathan held to the principle that had carried him from the aisle of Flight 372 to the pinnacle of corporate reform. Dignity, once restored, must be defended, not just with rules, but with grace. Months passed, and the turbulence of Flight 372 slowly transformed into a current of steady reform. What had begun as humiliation in the sky had become a blueprint for systemic change. Apex Airlines was no longer known merely for its fleet size or routes. It had become synonymous with accountability, redemption, and dignity. The impact was visible everywhere. Passengers reported measurable differences: friendlier staff, more transparent policies, and faster responses to complaints. The independent advocacy office Jonathan Miles had created released quarterly reports showing real numbers: racial bias complaints down by 60%, resolution times cut in half, passenger satisfaction at record highs. The press began calling it the dignity dividend, a phrase Jonathan never liked but tolerated because of the hope it carried. Yet the changes weren't just numbers. They were faces, voices, and stories. At a Houston community event, Greg Holman stood alongside activists he once might have dismissed, volunteering to mentor young people of color pursuing aviation careers. Linda Ward was now part of a peer education program, speaking candidly about the dangers of silent compliance. Mark Benson was still in Oklahoma, running weekend workshops on leadership and fairness. And in Dallas, the little girl who had drawn Jonathan as a shield was now the face of Apex new youth scholarship program, her smile beaming from posters with the tagline, "Every seat deserves respect." But transformation didn't come without cost. Jonathan knew the strain of leadership was etched into him more deeply than ever. His ribs had healed. But late at night, the ache of memory returned: the mob in the aisle, the cold of the closet, the weight of being underestimated again and again. He carried those scars quietly, but not with shame. They were reminders of what was at stake. One afternoon, Claire Simmons joined him in his office, placing a newspaper on his desk. The headline read, "Apex Airlines Sets New Industry Standard." Below it, an op-ed praised the airline's reforms as a once-in-a-generation example of corporate courage. "You've done it," Claire said softly. Jonathan looked at her, then at the skyline beyond. "No, we've done it. And it's not done. Change isn't a finish line. It's a discipline." Claire smiled. "You always have the perfect soundbite." He chuckled. "Not for sound bites, for survival." Later that week, Jonathan was invited to speak at a national aviation summit in Washington. DEC. CEOs from every major airline, regulators, civil rights leaders, and government officials filled the grand hall. As he took the stage, he noticed cameras everywhere. This speech would be streamed across the country, maybe the world. He didn't open with charts or slogans. He opened with a story. I was kicked off my own plane. He began, his voice steady. The room shifted uncomfortably. I was humiliated, assaulted, and locked away, not because of what I did, but because of who I was perceived to be. And while my title eventually shielded me, countless others have no such shield. They endure in silence, without cameras, without justice. That is the truth we must confront. He paused, letting the words settle. Faces leaned in. But here's another truth we can change. Systems can change. People can change. Apex Airlines is proof. We chose not only to punish, but to reform. Not only to condemn, but to offer second chances. And in doing so, we discovered something powerful. Dignity is not a luxury in air travel. It is the foundation. The applause began cautiously, then swelled into a standing ovation. For many in the room, it was more than a speech. It was a challenge. In the weeks that followed, other airlines announced their own reforms, some reluctantly, others inspired. A ripple spread outward: hotels, train companies, even tech firms citing Apex model as a framework for dignity-driven business. Jonathan received letters from strangers across the country, teachers, nurses, veterans, parents, all sharing how the story of Flight 372 had given them courage in their own struggles. One letter struck him most. It was from a former Apex passenger who wrote, "I used to dread flying, not because of turbulence, but because of the looks, the whispers, the way I was treated. After what you did, I flew again. And for the first time in years, I felt like I belonged. Thank you." Jonathan kept that letter in his desk drawer, pulling it out whenever doubt returned. The true test came 6 months later, when the Department of Transportation awarded Apex the National Service Medal for extraordinary leadership in restoring dignity and justice in air travel. At the ceremony, Jonathan accepted the medal quietly, dedicating it not to himself, but to every passenger who ever felt unseen. That evening, as he returned home, he found another letter waiting for him this time, handwritten. It was from Karen Doyle. The letter was halting, defensive at first, but softened as it went on. She admitted her shame, her fear of becoming a public villain, her struggles with facing the mirror every morning since the flight. She asked for no forgiveness, only the possibility of someday making amends. Jonathan read it twice, then set it aside. He didn't know yet what her redemption would look like, or if it would come at all. But he knew one thing: if it did, it would be earned. That night, Jonathan walked onto his apartment balcony, the city lights stretching like stars across the horizon. He thought of his father's words, his mother's strength, Claire's unwavering support, Elaine's precision, Greg's broken apology, Linda's tears, Mark's volunteer work, the little girl's drawings. He thought of the passengers whose silence once felt like betrayal, but had turned into applause when truth stood tall. He whispered to the night, "This is bigger than me." And in that whisper was the legacy of Flight 372. Not a scandal, not a crisis, but a turning point. A reminder that justice is not the absence of pain, but the presence of courage. That dignity is not a gift to be granted, but a right to be defended. Jonathan Miles, once humiliated in the aisle of his own plane, had become something greater than a chairman or CEO. He had become a steward not just of an airline, but of a principle that soared higher than any altitude. Every person, in every seat, deserves respect. The story of Jonathan Miles reminds us that dignity is not a luxury, it is a birthright. In life, we may all encounter moments when others see us as less, whether because of our age, our race, our status, or even our silence. But this story teaches us that our worth is not defined by how others treat us, it is defined by how we choose to respond. Jonathan could have sought revenge or buried the truth in private. Instead, he turned humiliation into a platform for justice. He showed that leadership is not about titles or power, but about protecting the dignity of every person, especially those without a voice. For older generations, this lesson rings deeply true. Respect and fairness are the foundations of every lasting community. We all carry scars from times when we were overlooked or underestimated. Yet, like Jonathan, we can transform those wounds into wisdom, and wisdom into change. The message is simple, but profound. Never compromise on dignity, yours or anyone else's. Justice begins when we refuse to accept less than respect for ourselves, for our families, and for those who come after us. Thank you so much for spending your time with us today. If this story moved you, if it made you reflect, or if it sparked hope in your heart, please give it a like. Share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to our channel. Together, let's keep spreading stories that remind us of the power of dignity, respect, and justice.